I know that a lot of kids are wondering, and as am I, if this is the end of Mason's story. Will we ever hear from Mason again, you think?
You are not likely to hear from Mason again, no. I feel like his story was a wrap. I think that, the person who probably still has a story left to be told is probably more like Matt Drinker. That's who's going to still face. And some people said to me, well, wait, what happens to them? What happens to them? And, I felt, I couldn't make it into a 600-page book, and Mason was my character I was going to follow. But the other sort of point I wanted to make with that, and maybe I need to be there to tell it, but what I think happens in cases like that is it is years before there's closure on cases of this kind, where a kid has made this horrible mistake, and that it might be a lot of years before he would be, brought to justice, or where that family would get any kind of justice. So no, I don't plan to write Mason again. I am more of a one-off author anyway. I'm more of a standalone books. I kind of wish I was a series author, because I enjoyed series when I was a kid. And I know that it can make people look forward to the next book, the next book, the next book, and they would like to know more about that cast of characters. But I feel fini, I feel like I'm done with the story. And I have another writing friend, and I joke about, well, did your characters all show up on stage and shake hands and say great show, and then we're going to move on to someone else's book now, or something like that. So I think it's sort of the way it is for me. And usually by the time I finish one book, I am well into the thought process, and maybe even have a notebook rolling on another book, or maybe even more than that. It may be one that I kind of set aside, and before I let let this one through faster or something. Whatever book is going to tell you its story more quickly gets onto the page. So, and think some are just a slower cooking process. So
Sure.
but yeah, no, I
Yeah.
don't think you'll see Mason again. I don't know what trouble would I give him. I really wouldn't want to. I want a happily ever after for him, and I feel like I left him in a much better place. His new normal is going to lift him up. So
Yeah, I agree. I think you left him in a great place too. I think you wrapped it up beautifully. And I have to say that as I go on from one of your books to the next, I'm always looking forward to the next character. I do remember you saying that Mason was particularly special to you, and I feel that way about him too. And that's why I wondered if maybe you had any plans for revisiting his story.
no, but I will say, I admit that it took me longer to slither back out of his skin and put on the next character and go be them, the way I needed to. So
Yeah.
the next book cranked out a little more slowly. Yeah, that wasn't so
Okay.
good for that confidence thing. It's like, now what have I done? Well, where I self-intimidated or whatever, because I thought, oh yeah, Mason was a really powerful guy, But people like
Yeah.
kinds of books too, and you have to remind yourself that. And the next book may not be as universally liked, or have the interest, but somebody will want to read it, and that has been happening, so that's great.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, that is the perfect segue into. I'm so excited about your newest book, which I haven't had a chance to read yet. So, A Home for Goddesses and Dogs.
Yes.
So it came into our library just before we closed down. So they were able to get processed, and they're there waiting for the lucky people who were
Yeah.
on the holds list. And we do have some digital copies, and I am on hold for that, but I'm a little out from getting it. So I'm super excited. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Sure, I'll tell you a little bit about it. It's funny. I mean, the book came out in late February, so right before everything happened with the COVID situation. And this is the cover right here, so that you can see what it looks like.
Beautiful.
And I really do love this cover. This art I thought was so great. The whole thing takes place in winter time. And what we have in this story is Lydia, who is 13, and her mother has recently died. And believe it or not, her death was expected, and her mother did a really nice job of, preparing her as much as anyone can prepare. It's a single parent household. So she is now what she calls herself finally fully orphaned, meaning that she's on her own, but she's not on her own. Her aunt Brat comes to get her she brings her from Rochester, New York, to a tiny town in rural Connecticut to live. And it's all new. And because even though she was prepared for her mother's death, doesn't mean she's not grieving. She certainly is. But she's also it's sort of been handled. Her mom reminded her that there was going to be a science to it, and that she should just kind of observe that, and that I'm dying. I'm not passing away. You haven't lost me. That's her mom's voice coming through. So she tells her that. And the other thing is that she comes with just a few possessions, but one of them is this box of the goddesses. And the goddesses are art collages that Lydia and her mother made together. And it's revealed in the first couple of chapters that often the goddesses were about something that they couldn't have or couldn't do because her mother had this weak heart and was really an invalid. And so they might have, missed a day when they hoped to take a trip to a flea market or something. And if they didn't make it, they would make the goddess of the flea market. And they, it kind of, heal themselves. They were almost like little meditations, something positive out of something negative, and also just the creation of art. We just make things and enjoy them that way. Later on, they'll become more important in terms of her memories of her mother. But that's a little further in. So she moves to this house with her Aunt Brat, and she meets Eileen, Aunt Brat's wife, and they live with an old man named Elleroy who owns the farm. And very shortly after Lydia, who is not a dog person, arrives, this big yellow rescue dog also arrives, and he's a whole lot of trouble. And Lydia is there to be helpful to her new adults. And so that means really pitching in with this dog, who, of course, is a bit of a mess. And, one thing I wanted to talk about with you guys just briefly, and so we don't go too long, is that this story kind of came because of a big yellow dog that we rescued, our Brumus, who is a big German Shepherd mix of some kind, who we got home, and, not a mean bone in his body, big, handsome, healthy, all of that, but really a mess. When he had a terrible time with housebreaking. He's very skittish and just this heartbreakingly mistrustful of humans, especially men. We also seem to be afraid of some other things which kind of fall into the book. But when we got him, in an effort to try to understand him and to try to assimilate him into just kind of think like the dog kind of thing, I began to sort of keep a diary in which I observed him and then speculated about his backstory. We really didn't know anything about his past, but there seemed to be certain dark elements. Why was he so afraid of everything with wheels? What happened there? Why was he kind of this terrified runaway sort of, all the time, and yet otherwise incredibly gentle. He wasn't food aggressive, but he was very food driven. And I know a lot of dogs are, but some aren't. But he was definitely, if you put it down, I'm going to eat all of it. And some other things too. He kind of had weak hind legs. It seemed like he hadn't had good exercise, and other things. So I began to imagine his backstory. And at one point I thought, oh my gosh, this is what I do every time a new character visits me. I begin to imagine their backstory, because nobody is born. None of my characters have been born the day the book opens, and all that backstory is informing who they are. So here I had a grieving girl arrive along with this dog. The dog could not tell you his backstory. The girl was choosing to let hers out only very, very slowly. And so they were sort of these foils for each other. They're making guesses about the dog. And I'm sure, although we don't hear from her adults in this way, I know that her adults must have been making a lot of guesses about her. And she was kind of making some guesses about what to reveal and when, or do I need to say this to them? Do they need to even know about this? No, I'm just going to be helpful. I'm going to be self-sufficient Lydia, So that kind of sets up the story for you, that these two, she's, obviously, you see on this cover, they think there's a pretty good chance she'll become a dog person, but there's going to be quite a process about that, and some revelations along the way. She actually is able to learn some things about the dog's actual backstory. So that was like a difference. But it began with just that element of nonfiction of me trying to figure out my new dog.
Yeah. Oh, I am so excited to read it.
Great.
Hearing that, because it's been hard, and I know our listeners are feeling that same way that we want to get these materials, and
yeah,
in this place right now where it's really hard to get what we want. But
I think mining our own lives for material is really useful if you're trying to do a little bit of writing. That's something that you can definitely do. Or if you've fallen in love with a book by another author and you're interested in that question about sequel, go ahead and write the chapter that happens after the last chapter in the book. You've got the character, you kind of know their voice, and it's just fun to play at. Don't worry, you're not plagiarizing, you're not stealing, you're growing something that caught on to. I know that there are little elements of characters I've seen in movies or read about in books in my characters too. They're really these composites, and that's totally fair game. You gotta, that's life, and that's where you should go to for these things. Terrific.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, well,
thanks.
I guess let's wrap up with what's next for you. So you have something in the works?
I do have something in the works. I'm actually gonna refer to a screen because the project is still new enough for me that I'm still learning about it. So I'm working on, the working title is Has Anybody Here Seen Frenchie? And it is narrated by Aurora Pauline Petriquin, who has just entered 6th grade and who has Asperger's syndrome, which is a developmental disorder that's related to autism. She's very intelligent, but her social skills are not kind of a match with the mainstream. She's not able to connect really well with kids her own age. And she tells you herself that she's a big old blurter and has trouble making friends. She does have, though, one best friend, and his name is Frenchie Livernois. And he is on the autism spectrum and has a more serious, a more severe type of autism. And he is actually nonverbal. And the whole story takes place in Maine, out in nature, and the two friends, they go exploring a lot. Aurora is a rock hound. She likes geology, and Frenchie is a bird enthusiast. And one of the sort of magical things about their relationship is that Aurora can really read Frenchie's behavior. She knows what simple changes in his posture mean. When they reach 6th grade, though, Aurora begins to do better socially because she's able to put into action some of the strategies that she's been taught and has been encouraged to practice. And she's beginning to, in a way, and it's not exactly outgrow, but she's able to socialize now. She begins to understand things, but Frenchie remains more the same. And so the story becomes about Aurora's growing awareness of that she is moving on in a way, but that she has this fierce underlying loyalty to her still best friend who is nonverbal. And so that's kind of the setup there. She makes a mistake or two in regard to him that becomes kind of the plot. One of the fun things about this book is I am not only in Aurora's point of view, which is new for me. I did that a little bit with a book called All Rise for the Honorable Perry T. Cook. I had his mom had a couple of chapters where they were dialed out kind of. I think of them as like they're like third person cloaks or third person limited or whatever. And some of the people in town have those chapters for this particular book. Now, I don't know that that's what you'll see when the book is finished and published because I'm not sure it's working, but that's what I'm exploring right now, which is great fun for me as a writer. And I think that's like important to do, kind of give yourself another challenge. But it is also authentically the way that I heard this book. So I'm hoping that I'm going to hear, that it does work when I turn the project into my editor. So that's next for me.
That's exciting. I am so happy to know, as I'm sure our listeners are, that we have something to look forward to coming from you, any idea? I know you're just barely into it, but any idea when we might see that book?
I think it's supposed to publish in 2022. I'm kind of a 2 year, I'm kind of, one book every 2 years. I'm not the fastest writer on the planet, but that's pretty much where things seem to fall for me. Yeah.
Okay.
That's a good writing pace for me. That way I feel secure enough to let it out, to let it out into the world,
Well,
All
I
those
think
confidence pieces.
yeah. Well, I think that's certainly working for you, Leslie.
Thanks, Tammy. It's
Can't
very
tell you how much I have appreciated all of your work. And Mason Buttle was especially really what I needed during this time, too. Just that encouragement, that, resilient, kind, wonderful character that he is. So
Thank you.
I have taken up so much of your time, much more than I
Oh,
intended to.
pleasure.
It's been
I love
so
it.
wonderful. Thank you so, so much for doing this. I can't wait to get this posted so our listeners get to get all this wonderful insight that you've given us.
Terrific. Well, I'm looking forward to the discussion too.
Yeah, me
I'm
too.
really interested to hear. They shouldn't hold back, I'm hoping anything, that they have questions about, or that they thought shouldn't have happened. I'm always happy to hear, that always, I take all that in for the next project. So yeah, that's really great.
Yeah, okay, good.
I'm so proud to have those readers. It's wonderful. And thank you so much for doing this. I
Well,
appreciate
of
it.
course.
Yeah.
Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Until we meet again then.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Leslie.
Thanks.